Hello cake people! In this video I'm going to show you how I made a crazy diamond pattern inside this super tall chocolate matcha cake. This is not an easy technique, but it's super cool and will show you the basics of how I think about decorating from the inside out. I have my cold, firm, butter-based chocolate cakes all torted into very thin layers, which you can see how I do in my basic cake fussy cutting video. I've linked to that below so you can check it out. I baked 6 cakes that are 6-inch rounds for this project. I like to work with smaller sized cakes because they are cuter, but also easier to get fussy with than those wider diameter cakes. So let's get started with step 1. Layering our cake segments. Each of the 6 cakes I baked will be layered into a short cake separately, so that's 6 separate smaller cakes, so that later I can work my pattern into each one individually and then layer them up. I'm going to use both acrylic rounds and cardboard rounds to support my individual cakes while I'm working on them before I stack them all up. You can use either or both, it really doesn't make a difference. I'm putting down a wet square of paper towel to hold the board in place to make sure that it doesn't go anywhere. And I'm spreading a bit of matcha buttercream down to anchor my cake to the board, just a little bit to keep things stable. I'm using a standard small icing spatula here. Okay, placing my first layer of cake down, and I'm using my fingers to make sure that it's centered. So much of my techniques depend on being super careful about centering things as much as possible, so take the time to make sure that you're centered. Next, I'm dolloping some matcha buttercream onto the middle of my layer and using my spatula to smooth it out, making sure it's pretty thin, and even more importantly, it's super even. Then I'm adding my next layer and I press it down gently to fix it to the buttercream. And repeat. Spreading the buttercream, adding the next layer, making sure it lines up with all the layers below. So important. Each of my 6 chocolate cakes has 5 super thin layers, so I keep going until I've added the 5th layer as a cap, and then I smooth down the buttercream on the sides of the cake to make sure there aren't any gaps in the edges of the buttercream filling. This makes trimming the sides down easier for me later on. All right, let's speed through these next ones. You're going to repeat the same process with all remaining cakes, and you'll have 6 separate short layered cakes in the fridge when you're done. On to step 2, which is where things start to get interesting. We're going to start putting the diamond pattern into our 6 cakes separately, so that when we stack them, we will stack that pattern together and be able to reveal that in a final giant slice at the end. Starting with the first cake I layered, so that's the one that was chilling for the longest, I'm going to start patterning. I am inserting my knife into my cake about ½ an inch from the edge at an angle, roughly 45 degrees if you want to get technical with it. I'm holding the knife perfectly steady and at the same angle as I start to rotate the turntable, cutting until I get back to where I started and can fully release the piece that I have just cut out. Check it out, it's a cone shape. Next, I'm using my small icing spatula to get some slightly lighter colored matcha buttercream onto the sloping sides of the open cake that we've just revealed when we're removing our cone. And I'm getting that buttercream into a thin, even layer in there. When that looks nice and smooth, I'm just going to pop that cone right back in where it came out. I'm pressing down on it to make sure it nestles in pretty tight because I don't want any spaces between the cake cone and the buttercream that I just laid down. So what I've just done is created a cone-shaped plane of buttercream inside the cake, which is going to create cool lines when we cut into it. And we're gonna do it again, 5 more times. So every one of our 6 cakes has the same kind of cone layer cut through the middle. The knife I'm using is just a standard paring knife. That's one of the reasons that I like to work with smaller cakes because shorter knives and shallower cuts make for better control throughout this whole process. So this is a really tricky technique. It can take some getting used to. It definitely didn't come out perfectly the first few times I tried it, and it's still not perfect for me now. But it's so cool looking that it hardly matters if it isn't 100% even and straight when you make your final cut. I'm using a lighter color of buttercream for making the diamond shape than I used when I was layering the cakes up in step 1 because I want the diamond shape to contrast with the darker chocolate cake and the deeper matcha layers of buttercream. So I want that diamond shape to look like a coherent pattern. But it would also look great with the same color of buttercream all the way through. There's really no right way to do this, and you can use whatever colors you like. And now I can start to stack my cakes. I'm being careful to think about what I want my final design to look like. So when I start, rather than putting the first cake down exactly the way that I had it when I was cutting the cone out of it, I'm actually going to flip it upside down because that's going to affect the final shape. Then the next cake layer that I put on top, I'm actually going to keep that one the way that I had it situated when I was cutting the cone out of it and replacing the cone. So that one does not get flipped upside down. The next one is going to be flipped upside down. The one following that is going to stay right side up, and so on. And in this way, you'll see, I'll break it down at the end, that's how we're creating a series of diamonds rather than just stacked V's. At this point, all of my cakes have been in the fridge for another 10 minutes at least, just to make sure that they're firm and set and that the buttercream isn't going anywhere. Are stacking and stacking all the way up, making sure that each new cake that gets added to our giant sort of mega cake is getting a thin layer of buttercream before it gets laid down to keep it in place. Wow, and there we have it, a giant tower of cake. I promise you what's going on the inside here is so cool. But before we get to that, we need to clean this cake up a little bit and get our decoration on there. All right, on to step 3, decorating. I'm using my favorite serrated knife here just to trim away the edges of the cake. I personally really like to have a super clean cut, as clean as possible, and part of that is making sure that all of my edges are trimmed off of the cake all the way around. This is a very satisfying move because when you're finished, the naked cake that you have in front of you is going to look so much cleaner than what it looked like before. And it means that your buttercream is going to go on smoother as you're decorating, and also, of course, that your final slice is going to look a lot cleaner as well. So I'm just working my way around the cake, making sure that I'm not cutting too deep because I don't want to waste any cake here. I'm just trying to smooth things out, even them out, and get the little edges that are sort of sticking out and making the cake less smooth on the sides. I want to get those off of there. And I'm just going to clear some of that away. Obviously, most of this is going to go towards future snacking, so don't feel like you're wasting too much because you get to eat everything that you just cut off of the cake. We're going to be using a technique that is called fault line decorating for a cake, and I've actually been credited with starting that trend, which is kind of exciting. It actually came about because I ran out of buttercream one day and was too lazy to make more. So, happy accidents. I'm starting out by laying down a crumb coat. I always like to do this just because I want my final layer of buttercream to be super clean, and also when I'm doing a fault line cake, I like to keep some of my super finicky layering exposed because I think it looks really cool. But if you don't put any buttercream over it and that cake is going to be sitting out for a little while, it's going to dry out. Even in the refrigerator, it's gonna get dry, and so then those bits that were exposed are going to be kind of crusty and weird and taste like refrigerator, which is horrible. Now I've got my lovely extra gigantic cake scraper, which, as big as it is, it's actually not quite big enough for one of my cakes, which are just ridiculously tall. So sometimes instead of using a cake scraper, I'll actually use a very large quilting ruler. And that's what I've actually used, what I used for years before I got my cake scraper. But sometimes you do want the kind of firmness that the metal scraper is going to give you, as opposed to a plastic quilting ruler, which is a bit more flexible. But plenty of tools out there. You can go to Home Depot and find stuff to smooth your cakes. It's really sort of open-ended, and whatever you find that works, just go for it, as long as you're fairly confident that it's going to be food safe. And now I'm just cleaning up my edges a little bit here, just to make sure everything is staying neat, as I am going to refrigerate this cake for a little bit and then move on to next steps. Alright, so I've got a piping bag that's filled with my darker matcha buttercream, and I am just turning my cake as I'm piping the buttercream onto the sides. It is a very hot day today, unfortunately, and my buttercream is super soft, but it doesn't matter. It's going to look pretty messy while you're getting started, but you're going to be going over it with your icing smoother, and that's going to make everything flush and beautiful, so it doesn't matter too much that it looks crazy now. So this seems like a good place to create my first break. So I'm leaving some space in between where I was piping before and where I'm piping now. And I'm leaving quite a bit of space because my buttercream is quite soft. So I know that when I come back in with my icing scraper, it's going to push a lot of the buttercream around, and it's going to close a lot of that space that I'm leaving. So I know that if I want a fairly small space, a small gap to be left, then I need to give, actually way more space when I'm piping. And now I'm finishing my piping by just squirting some buttercream up on top. Isn't that beautiful? Don't worry, it's all gonna get smoothed out. But first I'm going to clean up the top really quick and just make sure that that is nice and smooth before I move on to smoothing the sides. All right, fun part. I'm gonna start smoothing out my buttercream. with my cake scraper here, making sure to clean it off of buttercream as often as I need to while I'm going along, just to keep it as clean as possible. And even though it's still pretty rough at this point, you can already see that it's starting to look cleaner, smoother. It's just a matter of being patient and going around, enough times and dabbing in some extra buttercream as you need to, where there are gaps that have appeared that you don't necessarily want. It's really up to you. This is a very forgiving technique, so you can really play with it and do what you want and create the textures that you want. That's one of the great things about buttercream, is that you get to play with this really interesting, beautiful texture, and there are endless ways that you can approach decorating with it. You can see that the pattern that's being created here in these empty gaps that I'm creating, it's pretty organic and kind of natural looking, and I think that's where the name fault line came from. It's this idea that you're just kind of letting the nature of the buttercream and the pressure you're putting against it create this sort of fall as it may kind of pattern that looks very organic and is pretty cool when you look at it. And I'm also being just really, really fussy because that's who I am. And this is one of my favorite parts of decorating, is just getting to mess around and play and just kind of see what works and what I like and what I don't, and kind of work with it in the moment. And if you're finding that your buttercream is still fairly rough and is kind of pitting and doing other things that you don't like very much, you can also run your icing scraper under hot water and get it heated up a little bit, wipe the water off, and while it's still warm, you can do another pass, and that heated metal is going to smooth your buttercream out if it's just been sitting for too long and it's getting cold and difficult to work with. All right, we made it! On to the final step, which is where we're actually going to cut into the cake and see what we created. It looks amazing. I'm super pleased with it. And let's just take a look here a little bit closer and really break down how we achieve this effect. So you can see here that there is this triangle shape that I'm outlining with my finger. That is the shape that we cut out initially. That was that cone, right? When you cut a cone in half, what do you get? You get a triangle. And so when we inserted those cones into our cake with buttercream, we were creating a series of triangles. When we flipped some upside down and kept some right side up, those triangles were coming together to create diamonds. It's a little bit of a trip, but it's super cool, and if you can wrap your head around how that works, there are so many options for what you can do and how you can play with the inside of the cake. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. I would love to hear your thoughts. I would love to see any cakes that you make. Please, comment with a link. I'm super excited to see what people do with this. And if you're curious about how I create super thin layers, if you haven't seen that video yet, I'm linking to that below. And thank you so much for joining me. This has been a Milk Moon signature technique. Subscribe to my channel for more.